So picture this. It's the summer of 1974. Out of nowhere, a few banks start to fail, one after the other. And it's not just a small problem, it sends these massive shockwaves through the entire global financial system. It was this totally chaotic few months that, well, it basically exposed how incredibly fragile everything was. And because of that chaos, the world's top bankers were forced, almost against their will, to sit down and write the very first rule book for how international finance should work. And that's a pretty big deal, right? I mean, how did a few bank failures way back in 1974 end up shaping the stability of your bank today? We're going to dive right into that because the answer is actually fascinating. You know, all those rules and safety nets that protect your money right now, they didn't just appear out of thin air. Nope, they were forged in the fire of this one single chaotic summer. And if you understand what happened to them, it tells you so much about the financial world we're all living in today.
All right, so to really get what went so wrong, we have to set the scene. Think of the early 1970s as, well, the Wild West of international banking. Seriously. The old, super stable system that had been around for decades, it was just completely falling apart at the seams.
And just look at how fast everything was changing. It's kind of nuts. In just a couple of years, the world goes from these fixed, stable currency rates to this totally new floating system that, well, nobody really knew how to handle. At the exact same time, places like London are deregulating like crazy, which just fuels this massive lending boom. And then, bam, the OPEC oil crisis hits and sends the global economy into a total tailspin. You've got this whole generation of traders who have literally never seen this kind of volatility before. It was a perfect storm. And right into the middle of this perfect storm, this new thing called the Eurodollar market just explodes onto the scene. What is it? Well, you can think of it as this giant, completely unsupervised swimming pool of US dollars, but they're all held in banks outside the United States. And that meant they were totally beyond the reach of US regulators. It just grew like crazy, and it pulled in all sorts of new banks. Some of them, well, let's just say not so reliable. They were all just eager to get a piece of the action. It was a frontier town with absolutely no share. So all of this, it all leads us to the summer of '74. This was the moment of truth. This brand new, unregulated system was about to be put to the test. And oh boy, did it fail. Spectacularly. It took just 3 specific bank collapses to show everyone just how deep the cracks in the foundation really were. Okay, first step. The first and definitely the most famous domino to fall was a German bank called Bankhaus Herstatt. Now, its collapse wasn't just, a simple failure. It was more like a detonation. It sent shrapnel flying across the entire global banking system and uncovered a brand new kind of risk that literally nobody had even thought about before. And just to give you a sense of the scale here, Herstadt's total liabilities were a staggering $840 million. Now, I know that might not sound like a ton compared to the trillions we hear about today, but trust me, back in 1974, that was a massive, massive number. It caught everyone completely by surprise. Turns out, the bank had been secretly making these huge, totally reckless bets on the currency markets and just hiding the losses. And this is where the real problem, the really interesting part comes in. So German regulators shut the bank down at 4:30 in the afternoon German time. But here's the kicker. It was only 10:30 in the morning in New York. You see the problem? Herstatt had already received a bunch of payments from banks in Europe, but it hadn't sent the US dollars back to them from its New York operations yet. And then the doors slammed shut. So suddenly, all of these other banks had paid up, but they were never, ever going to get their money back. And this new kind of risk, born out of something as simple as a time zone difference, got a name: Herstatt Risk. And believe it or not, that's a danger that still exists today, which is why we have these incredibly complex systems designed just to stop that from ever happening again. The fallout was just immediate, and it went global in a flash. Just look at this list. These are just the banks in London that took a hit. We're talking about banks from the UK, Switzerland, the US, Kuwait, heck, even the Soviet-owned Moscow Narodny Bank got caught up in this. It was the ultimate proof that in this new, hyper-connected world, a bank failing in Cologne, Germany, could instantly threaten a bank in Moscow. All right, next case. This one was a totally different kind of mess. Get this. A young, pretty junior trader at a tiny little branch of the absolutely massive Lloyds Bank. He was in Lugano, Switzerland. He managed to lose $78 million. That was something like 40% of the entire bank's profits for the year.
And he did it all on these reckless, unauthorized trades and just hid the losses for months. It was a huge wake-up call that even the biggest, most respected banks had literally no clue what was going on in their own little branch offices. And now for the final piece of this puzzle, the collapse of a small bank in London called the Israel British Bank. Now, on the surface, okay, it looks like another case of fraud. But what happened next is what's really important. Its failure set off this huge fight between the regulators in the UK and the regulators in Israel over one simple question. When a foreign-owned bank fails, whose job is it to clean up the mess?
So you see, the really crucial thing to get here is that these three failures, they weren't just random isolated incidents. Not at all. Together, they were like a diagnostic test on the entire global financial system, a full body scan. And the results? They were absolutely terrifying. They showed these fatal structural flaws that nobody, and I mean nobody, had a plan for.
So let's just break it down nice and simple. Herstatt, that exposed the crazy reality of settlement risk in a market that never sleeps. Lloyd's, that proved that these giant global banks didn't even have the most basic controls over what their own people were doing. And the Israel British Bank, well, that revealed this gaping, dangerous hole in who was actually supposed to be watching over these international branches, the classic home versus host problem.
And this right here shows that standoff perfectly. You had the Bank of Israel, the home supervisor, basically saying, hey, that London office is your problem, UK. Meanwhile, the Bank of England, the host supervisor, is pointing right back and saying, nope, a parent company in Israel is responsible. And while they're just pointing fingers and arguing, the whole system is frozen. It's that classic situation where if everyone's in charge, it means no one is. And wow, this quote from the governor of the Bank of Israel at the time, it just says it all. There is no doubt in my mind that this institution has engaged in unsound and irresponsible practices. He's basically just washing his hands of the whole mess, and in the process, he's pretty clearly blaming the UK regulators for not catching the fraud themselves. The trust between countries, which is so critical for financial stability, had just completely evaporated. So, as you can imagine, the absolute chaos of that summer finally forced regulators to do something. But listen, this was not some grand visionary plan, not even close. It was more like a reluctant revolution. You had these central bankers being dragged, kicking and screaming, into creating the world's very first framework for supervising international banks. And the direct result was this. In December of 1974, the world's top central banks got together and formed a new group. It was based in Basel, Switzerland, and it's known as the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. Its mission was dead simple. Figure out how to make sure the summer of '74 never, ever happens again. And you know what? That same committee still exists today, and it is incredibly powerful. But it's funny, you have to look at how limited their ambition was when they started. The very first chairman, a British guy named George Blunden, he made it crystal clear. He said their goal was not to harmonize how different countries supervised their banks. They weren't trying to create some all-powerful global regulator. No way. National sovereignty was everything. The goal was just to share some information and plug the most obvious gaping holes, not to build a whole new system from scratch. And that led them to this really crucial fork in the road. The first idea, the one that came from the Herstatt mess, was to build this really complex global early warning system to spot troubled banks. But that was just way too ambitious. Nobody wanted to share that kind of sensitive data. So they scrapped it. And instead, they went with a much simpler solution, inspired by the Israel British Bank fiasco. Let's just clearly write down on a piece of paper who is responsible for what. Simple as that. And what about the internal controls problem, the one the Lloyd's scandal blew wide open? Well, the solution there was just as practical. Regulators like the Bank of England started sending out letters, basically a checklist, just like this one, telling banks for the very first time what was expected of them. You know, things that seem totally obvious to us today, like, hey, you should probably tell your regulator what your trading limits are, or maybe you should do some surprise audits. Back then, these were revolutionary ideas that had to be spelled out. So, okay, they made some rules, they plugged some holes, and a sense of calm kind of returned to the system. But the story doesn't end there, not by a long shot. Because the core problems that were exposed back in 1974, they never really went away, and you can hear their echoes in pretty much every major financial crisis that's happened since. That final agreement they came up with was called the Basel Concordat. And look, it was a huge achievement, the first global rulebook of its kind, but it was built on a really fragile foundation.
See, it established principles, but it couldn't actually force different countries to trust each other or to share secret information about their banks. It couldn't solve the very problem that caused the whole mess in the first place.
And that is why this whole story still matters so much today. Just think about the 2008 global financial crisis. What was a huge part of that? The failure of Lehman Brothers, a massive international bank. And just like with the Israel-British Bank all those years ago, regulators in different countries were scrambling, trying to coordinate, totally unsure of who was responsible for what. The echoes of 1974 were just undeniable. If you look at the heart of every major financial crisis since then, you find the exact same problems, a breakdown in cross-border cooperation and these dangerous gaps where nobody's quite sure who's in charge.
And that brings us all the way back to the question we started with, the summer of 1974. It gave us the basic blueprint, the architecture for how we supervise banks today. But it also exposed this fundamental conflict between global markets and national regulators, and that conflict is still very much with us. Yeah, we've built taller walls and stronger fences since then, but the fault lines underneath are exactly the same. So it really makes you wonder, is our global financial system truly any safer today? Or are we just getting better at preparing for the last crisis?